Welcome to Applicata Biblia. My name is Mark, and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by so we can study a little of God's Word. This is another installment of what we call a walk through the Bible or a study of Bible characters. I do have a blog. If you want to go see my notes on the blog, I'll put a link in the description for it, as well as a link to a copy of the first book for the installment. The series essentially just walks the entire scriptures, and it's really meant for younger people, but it doesn't matter who you are. It is not a severely over in-depth sort of study unless you want to make it that yourself. And it's really for teachers to teach younger people who maybe don't really understand the scriptures, even though that maybe they go to church every week, but they don't understand the structure of the scriptures, and they don't understand that the message of God is one continuous linear communication, and it's important to get that across to our young people, I think. So who are we going to get into today? Well, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 16. I'm not going to read it here. I'm just going to explain who it's about and what we should learn from it, and if you're teaching it, what it is that you should be trying to teach your students. We are about 2,000 years after creation, and we're in the time of Abraham. Now, last week we talked about Abram and a little bit about his wife, Sarah. And and so today, I wanted to go over Abraham's, I want to call him his second wife, because really, technically, that's kind of who she is, right? Her name is Hagar, and she has a son named Ishmael. Now, it's important to see this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Sarah as well. In the series, in the book, I don't point out Sarah so much because she's in both of these stories, and it's important to see not only what she does, what Abraham does, and what Hagar and Ishmael end up doing later. It's important to see all of these things from a very 10,000 foot view, that 30,000 foot view, if you will, to look at the entire picture. It's not about just looking at what they did, but also how it applies to what God has planned for his creation, which is Jesus the Christ, of course. So what's going on in this story in chapter 16? Well, Sarah comes up with this idea. Now, they're about 10 years into their wandering. So, I think we talked about it last time. Abraham was 75 when he was called by God. And Sarah is about 10 years younger than him. So, at this point, he's about 85, going on to 86, something like that. And Sarah would be about 75 years old. And we kind of need to go back and remember what the promise is to Abraham. And I'm going to do an expository, a very brief expository on the implications of the promises to Abraham in another video coming up. But here they are. They're fairly along in their life now. People lived longer in those days if they didn't die from some accident or disease or something. We know that Abraham lives to be over 100 years old, obviously, and we'll get into that as well. But so what's the story here? They're pretty old. God has given him a promise that all nations will be blessed through him, that through his ancestry, his people will be more than the stars in heaven and all that kind of, all of those kind of all those illustrations that God gives him to think about, and more than the sand of the sea, that kind of thing. There's going to be you're going to have a lot of ancestors after you, and here they are. They're pretty old, and they have no children. Well, Sarah has this great idea. She's like, look, Abraham, obviously I'm barren. I am not going to bear you any children. So you need to get with my slave girl, my handmaid, Hagar, and have a child with her. That's what she says. In verse 2 of chapter 16, Jehovah has kept me from bearing, so go in now to my slave girl. Perhaps I may be built up from her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. Her name was still Sarai. So he listens to her, which, he probably should have thought it through a little more, but he didn't. And they go through with it, and Hagar has a child. She has a son for Abraham. And of course, this is a great thing for Abraham. He's just like, wow, I got a son. He's overjoyed about it. He loves Ishmael ultimately. Well, of course, after a time, once Hagar has this child, she starts to despise Sarah. It says that. And it says in verse 4, when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarah said to Abraham, my injury be upon you. I gave you my slave girl into your bosom. And she saw that she had conceived, and I was despised in her eyes. Let Jehovah judge between me and you. But Abram said to Sarai, your slave girl is in your hand. Do to her what is good in your eyes. And Sarah dealt harshly with her, and she fled from before her. So there's this rift already, and this is just human nature. This is not for us to stand back and judge anybody. Hagar obviously feels like, okay, I'm going to bear this child. I'm doing better than her. And so she treats her like that. And of course, Sarai is having none of it, and she goes to her husband and says, what's going on here? This can't stand. He goes, well, he says, she's your handmaiden, you take care of it. So she treats her harshly. Well, I'm not going to read the rest of the story, but I will tell it to you. Hagar is so flabbergasted by the reaction that Abraham is still giving what is due to his real wife, who is Sarai. She is the boss, and he is not going to go against that. And that is rightfully the way. If you're going to have two wives, that's the way you would have to do it. Not should. Two wives is just never a good idea. One's enough, really. So Hagar gets really upset, and she runs off. And the Lord visits her and says, Sarah, where are you running from and where are you going to? And she talks about how, Sarai was mistreating her, and she is told to go back. She's told to go back and live with Abraham and Sarah. And he also says some other things about what's going to happen as a prophecy. So what do we learn from this story? Let me go through the questions real quick, and then we'll just kind of wrap this all up. The questions that you find online, and they're just simple questions. Why was it important for Sarah to bear children? Well, of course, during that day and time, the most important thing a woman could do for her husband, and I would say even still today, is for her to bear children, so the family name could carry on, or so that at least for a generation, like if you have a child and she takes another name, at least for at least a generation, your name would be remembered. So it's important that a woman has children for her husband in this day and time. That is the most important thing a woman can do for her husband. And Sarah obviously was bearing that burden of not being able to have children. And it's obviously tearing her up to the point where she says, "Take my handmaiden," which is a horrible idea. So what happens to Hagar's attitude? She becomes envious, or she becomes arrogant about carrying this child. And so, again, because she sees it as, she's perceiving this as, okay, my child is going to be the heir apparent. So I have this power. Abraham wisely put a stop to that because he's smart. That's why. Because he knows that Sarah is his wife, rightfully so, who gets first of everything. How does this angel describe Ishmael? This angel that visits Hagar explains to her that her son will be a nation like a wild donkey, and he will be against everyone, and everyone will be against him. And so we see this story of human nature, of people clearly looking for an answer to the promises that God had promised. You know, the promise of what was supposed to happen with Abraham. Well, in Abraham's day, they never even had a house. They had tents and they were nomadic. Here they are. They're trying to, in my mind anyway, it seems like they're trying to help God along. And of course, it's just a terrible idea. And of course, what's the lesson? Well, the lesson that we learn is we need to temper our faith with patience to know that God will do things in his own time. The things that he has promised us, he will do in good time. And there's sometimes that we don't get everything that we think we want because it simply isn't God's will that we get that. But that is the overriding message of this is waiting for God to do things in his own time, because Sarah will have a child, and we're going to talk about that. There are other things in here as well. Tradition says that the descendants of Ishmael become the Arab nations in the region. And of course, we know that those nations, as well as others, become problems for Israel later. And we know that the idolatry that they bring is an evil influence on believers of God in the region, year after year after year. They'll do really well, then they'll fall away, and they'll go after these idols. And so, in a sense, this idea of this nation being a wild donkey, even against Israel itself, plays out. And we can see that even today, all these years later. So those are the main lessons that we see in this. And of course, we also see that in the Christ as well. Ultimately, there's this wide view of God in between man and God, and we see mankind hyper-focus on God eventually, and they're looking for this Christ. And that is many, many years after this. and that ends up being Jesus. And again, it's mankind needing to just wait on God for him to do what he's going to do to manifest how he accomplishes things. And I would just say, in my mind, the more and more that I study that first church and those first churches that came out of the scriptures, or what God is looking for. That is what God is looking for. But as we see, when we look into history, we see how the church became apostatized, and how, I guess that's the word, how it just kind of went off the rails. And we're going to talk more and more about that. How churches just kind of went off the rails, and they stopped just looking at their scriptures, and they started listening to men. That is the problem. And I've said this before, when I talked about defecting from atheism, I was looking for something that was not contingent on the whims of men. And unfortunately, there are a lot of churches that do just that. They rely on what a man says. They rise up, they put these men up on a pedestal who have no place there. There's only one that belongs there, and that's Jesus. And all these people, these men have made doctrines over the years. And it's just stuff they make up. And they're not just reading their scriptures and reading them for the simplicity of how they speak to us. And, they make a doctrine and call it wisdom, but it's their own wisdom. Anyway, that's a little bit of a rabbit trail. I just do that every time. But that is the message that I find in here, and there's lots of others. And if you're going to teach this, I'm sure you'll find your own. So thank you very much for stopping by. And I think next time we're going to talk about Isaac. Thank you so much. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next one.